What happens at the precise moment when battlefield logic says the fight is over, but one officer decides it is not, and the men on the other side must choose between restraint, escalation, and survival? That question frames a recurring and often misunderstood reality of World War II combat, where surrender was not a simple ritual but a fragile negotiation conducted under extreme pressure, uncertainty, and the constant threat of sudden violence. By the later stages of the war in Europe, U.S. forces encountered increasing numbers of German units that were isolated, outnumbered, or cut off from higher command. In theory, such conditions favored surrender. In practice, they created some of the most dangerous encounters of the war. A German major refusing to surrender was not an abstract act of defiance, but a decision shaped by ideology, fear, misinformation, and personal responsibility for the men under his command. For the American soldiers facing him, the refusal transformed what should have been a controlled transition into a volatile standoff. U.S. Army doctrine emphasized the acceptance of surrender whenever offered, but it also recognized that refusal to surrender left no ambiguity about hostile intent. This distinction mattered profoundly at the tactical level. An enemy who continued to resist, regardless of circumstances, was treated as an active combatant. The moment a German officer rejected surrender terms, the encounter shifted from negotiation to combat readiness, often within seconds. American soldiers were trained to make that transition without hesitation. Many such encounters occurred during clearing operations, when U.S. infantry advanced through towns, forests, or defensive strongpoints already bypassed by the main front. German officers in these situations often lacked reliable information about the broader strategic collapse unfolding around them. Cut off from communications, they operated on outdated orders that emphasized holding ground or resisting to the last. A major, as a field-grade officer, bore responsibility not only for his own actions, but for the fate of dozens or hundreds of subordinates, a burden that sometimes hardened resolve rather than softened it. American soldiers approaching these positions were under their own pressures. Casualty rates in close combat were highest during such clearing actions, precisely because uncertainty was greatest. A white flag could conceal a trap. A negotiation could mask a delaying tactic. U.S. units learned quickly that hesitation could be fatal. The refusal of surrender by a German major therefore triggered a doctrinally supported response: overwhelming force applied swiftly to eliminate resistance. This response was not impulsive violence, but a calculated decision shaped by experience. Earlier in the war, Allied troops had suffered losses when surrender gestures were used deceptively, or when defenders reopened fire during negotiations. By 1944 and 1945, many American units adopted a posture of conditional restraint, willing to accept surrender instantly, but equally prepared to destroy resistance without warning if refusal was clear. A German major's decision closed the door on negotiation. The methods employed varied by situation but followed a consistent logic. Infantry units would isolate the resisting position, call forward heavy weapons, and apply firepower designed to break resistance quickly. Mortars, machine guns, and artillery were used not out of anger but to impose a decisive imbalance. The objective was not punishment but resolution. The longer a refusal persisted, the greater the risk to American lives, and the more force was deemed acceptable. In some cases, U.S. officers made final attempts to communicate, often through interpreters or loudspeakers, reiterating the hopelessness of the situation. These efforts served both tactical and moral purposes. They demonstrated compliance with the laws of war while placing responsibility for continued bloodshed squarely on the refusing commander. When such attempts failed, the transition to assault was immediate. German majors who refused surrender did so for varied reasons. Some feared retribution from their own superiors if they survived captivity. Others believed Allied forces would mistreat prisoners, despite evidence to the contrary. Ideological indoctrination also played a role, particularly among officers steeped in notions of honor and duty that equated surrender with betrayal. These motivations mattered little to the American soldiers tasked with advancing under fire. The consequences of refusal were often devastating for the defending unit. Isolated positions lacked the resources to withstand sustained American firepower. Once heavy weapons were brought to bear, resistance collapsed quickly, either through casualties or forced surrender under far worse conditions than initially offered. Survivors frequently later acknowledged that earlier surrender would have saved lives on both sides. For U.S. soldiers, these encounters left lasting impressions. Veterans recalled the emotional tension of moments when surrender was expected but denied, when the rules seemed clear yet the outcome uncertain. The decision to escalate force was understood as necessary but not abstract. It carried the weight of knowing that a different choice by the enemy commander could have changed everything. These incidents also reinforced American perceptions of the war's closing stages. As Germany's strategic situation deteriorated, the persistence of resistance at the tactical level appeared increasingly irrational, deepening frustration among Allied troops. Each refusal to surrender extended a conflict whose outcome was no longer in doubt, sharpening the sense that ideology and command rigidity were costing lives unnecessarily. From an institutional perspective, such encounters validated U.S. Army emphasis on decisive action under uncertainty. Training stressed that ambiguity was dangerous, and that clarity, once established, demanded immediate response. A German major's refusal provided that clarity, however grim its implications. The resulting actions were not deviations from policy but expressions of it. These moments illuminate the human dimension of command decisions in World War II. A single officer's choice reverberated outward, shaping the fate of his unit and the actions of the enemy facing him. Pressure distorted judgment, uncertainty narrowed options, and consequences unfolded rapidly, often irreversibly. The broader pattern of these encounters challenges simplified narratives of surrender and defeat. War did not end uniformly across the front. It ended in fragments, shaped by individual decisions made under stress, misinformation, and fear. The refusal of surrender by a German major was one such fragment, revealing how, even at the war's margins, the machinery of violence remained poised to act. As American forces continued advancing, they carried these experiences forward, shaping expectations for future encounters. Each refusal reinforced the lesson that victory did not eliminate danger, and that even when the strategic outcome was settled, tactical reality demanded constant readiness. In this way, the actions taken when surrender was refused became part of the lived knowledge of the U.S. Army, influencing behavior as the war pressed on into its final, uncertain months. As the war moved deeper into German territory, the frequency of these confrontations increased rather than diminished. The collapse of centralized command structures meant that responsibility devolved downward, placing disproportionate weight on individual officers. German majors commanding ad hoc battle groups, rear area security units, or remnants of shattered formations often operated with incomplete information and no clear line of retreat. In such conditions, refusal to surrender became less a strategic decision than an existential one, shaped by fear of captivity, concern for civilian populations nearby, or the belief that resistance might still influence events beyond their immediate surroundings. American soldiers entering these encounters carried their own accumulated experience. By late 1944 and early 1945, most frontline units had endured months of combat, witnessing both genuine surrenders and lethal deceptions. This experience hardened judgment. When a German major rejected surrender terms, U.S. troops no longer viewed the situation as a dialogue, but as confirmation of hostile intent. The emotional shift was subtle but decisive, transforming tension into action with practiced efficiency. The mechanics of escalation followed established patterns. Platoon and company commanders coordinated fire and maneuver to deny the defender any advantage of terrain or surprise. Smoke screens obscured movement, while flanking elements sought to cut off escape routes. The intent was to compress the enemy's options until surrender became unavoidable or resistance collapsed. Each step reflected doctrine refined through trial, error, and loss, emphasizing control over chaos rather than impulsive retaliation. These operations unfolded under intense time pressure. Clearing a resistant position delayed advances, exposed flanks, and tied down resources needed elsewhere. Higher headquarters expected rapid resolution, reinforcing the imperative to act decisively. American officers understood that lingering engagements increased risk not only to their own units, but to the broader operational plan. A German major's refusal thus carried implications far beyond the immediate firefight. The role of artillery and armor in these situations underscored the asymmetry of power. Once resistance was confirmed, U.S. units could draw on overwhelming support. Forward observers relayed coordinates within minutes, bringing down concentrated fire that few isolated positions could endure. Tanks, when available, advanced methodically, using direct fire to neutralize strongpoints. These measures were not expressions of excess, but applications of a doctrine designed to minimize friendly casualties through superiority of force. German defenders who survived such engagements often described a rapid psychological collapse once heavy fire commenced. Initial resolve gave way to the realization that isolation meant abandonment. For some, surrender came only after suffering losses that made earlier refusal appear tragically futile. These outcomes reinforced American perceptions that decisive force shortened engagements, even as they underscored the human cost of delayed capitulation. From a legal and ethical standpoint, U.S. forces operated within a framework that balanced restraint with necessity. The laws of war recognized the right of combatants to refuse surrender, but they also affirmed the attacker's right to eliminate resistance. American commanders were keenly aware that clear refusal absolved them of further obligation to negotiate. This clarity reduced hesitation at moments when ambiguity could prove fatal. The psychological toll on American soldiers should not be understated. Even when actions were doctrinally justified, the aftermath of close combat left lasting impressions. Veterans recalled the silence after gunfire ceased, the realization that lives had been lost over decisions made in moments of defiance. These memories complicated simplistic notions of victory, embedding a sense of moral weight alongside tactical success. Such encounters also influenced how U.S. troops interpreted German resistance more broadly. Persistent refusal to surrender at the tactical level contributed to a perception of fanaticism, reinforcing assumptions that negotiation was unreliable. This perception, in turn, shaped behavior in subsequent engagements, narrowing the space for trust and accelerating the cycle of escalation. At the same time, American forces distinguished between organized resistance and genuine surrender with remarkable consistency. Units processed thousands of prisoners during the final months of the war, demonstrating that refusal, not nationality, determined response. The contrast between these outcomes highlights how individual decisions shaped vastly different fates within the same collapsing system. The refusal of surrender by a German major thus becomes a lens through which to examine the granular reality of war's end. Strategic defeat did not dissolve the mechanisms of violence overnight. Instead, it fragmented authority, forcing individuals to navigate a narrowing set of choices under immense pressure. Each refusal extended the conflict locally, even as the broader outcome was sealed. These moments also reveal how armies internalize experience. By the war's final weeks, U.S. units operated with a shared understanding of what refusal meant and how it would be met. This understanding was not written solely in manuals, but forged through repeated encounters where hesitation proved costly. The result was a culture of conditional restraint, responsive to surrender but unforgiving of resistance. As American forces continued their advance, the pattern repeated itself across towns, forests, and improvised defensive lines. Each incident added to a cumulative narrative of how the war ended not with a single decisive moment, but through countless localized confrontations shaped by human judgment under stress. The actions taken when surrender was refused reflected an environment where clarity was rare, decisions were immediate, and consequences were irreversible, leaving open further examination of how individual choices define the war's final chapters. By the spring of 1945, as U.S. forces pushed deeper into the heart of Germany, the cumulative effect of these encounters became starkly visible. Entire towns, once bustling centers of civilian life, lay abandoned or heavily fortified, with small German units scattered in pockets of resistance. Majors and captains faced choices with disproportionate consequences, deciding whether to surrender, fight, or attempt escape. Each decision unfolded in real time, often under fire, with civilians, infrastructure, and the advancing Allies all in play. For American soldiers, the stakes were no longer hypothetical. Hesitation could result in ambush, sniper fire, or booby-trapped positions. Training and doctrine had prepared them to act, but every encounter carried uncertainty, and the consequences of misjudgment were immediate and severe. In many cases, the refusal of a German officer to surrender forced U.S. troops to adjust tactics on the fly. Infantry squads had to rapidly reassess their approach, weighing the risk of direct assault against the potential of envelopment or support from hidden defenders. Machine gun nests, reinforced buildings, and improvised obstacles transformed what might have been a straightforward occupation into a high-stakes engagement. Commanders had to maintain situational awareness while controlling dispersed elements, ensuring that friendly fire was minimized and that momentum toward the next objective was not lost. The psychological dimension of these standoffs was equally critical. American soldiers quickly learned to interpret hesitation, refusal, or evasive gestures by the enemy. The refusal to surrender often revealed intent, yet could also conceal fear, confusion, or miscommunication. Commanders developed heuristics for distinguishing between genuine resistance and uncertainty, relying on observation, interrogation, and sometimes sheer intuition. In these high-pressure environments, judgment was honed by repeated exposure, and every successful outcome reinforced the logic of decisive action when surrender was denied. Firepower remained the ultimate arbiter. Once refusal was confirmed, U.S. forces could rely on artillery, mortars, and armor to impose decisive pressure. Coordinated fire missions were executed with precision, often accompanied by psychological tactics such as warning shots, loudspeaker appeals, or visible maneuvering to demonstrate the futility of resistance. The goal was to resolve the engagement quickly while minimizing U.S. casualties. In many cases, the overwhelming application of force resulted in immediate surrender once the enemy recognized the impossibility of continued resistance. The dynamics of these encounters illuminate the complex interplay between doctrine, human psychology, and battlefield reality. U.S. soldiers were trained to recognize surrender, to protect prisoners, and to avoid unnecessary destruction. Yet they also faced the pressing need to neutralize threats that could delay operations or cause casualties. This dual imperative required rapid decision-making under conditions of extreme stress, highlighting how uncertainty and consequence shaped tactical choices. The experiences of individual soldiers further illustrate the human cost of these moments. Veterans recalled the tension of waiting behind cover, the adrenaline surge as resistance persisted, and the relief when surrender was finally accepted. They remembered the expressions of enemy officers, often a mixture of defiance, fear, and resignation, and the weight of responsibility in enforcing rules while maintaining safety. These personal recollections underscore that tactical decisions were not abstract, but intensely lived experiences with immediate moral and physical implications. Civilians, too, were drawn into the consequences of refusal. In towns where German officers refused to capitulate, local populations could become trapped between advancing troops and defending positions. U.S. forces had to account for their presence, adjusting fire and maneuver to reduce collateral damage while still enforcing the necessity of compliance. These layered pressures demonstrate the multifaceted nature of command, where operational, ethical, and humanitarian considerations converged in real time. The refusal of surrender also had strategic implications. Even small-scale resistance could slow advances, disrupt supply lines, or complicate coordination with adjacent units. Each isolated incident required higher command attention, sometimes drawing resources away from other objectives. Thus, the decision of a single German major had ripple effects, shaping operational tempo, logistics, and the allocation of forces across a theater of war. Documentation of these encounters shows a consistent pattern. American units approached refusal systematically, combining observation, negotiation, and, when necessary, overwhelming force. After-action reports frequently highlight the balance between attempting surrender first and acting decisively when refusal became clear. This balance reflects the U.S. Army's broader philosophy of proportional response, informed by both law and practical necessity. By the final weeks of the war, as German command structures collapsed, the frequency of these confrontations increased, but their stakes were paradoxically both smaller and larger. Fewer resources were available to defenders, making resistance less sustainable, yet the fragmented nature of enemy units meant that unpredictable acts of defiance could still endanger U.S. soldiers or delay operations. The enduring lesson was that surrender was never automatic, and each refusal required careful, immediate, and often forceful resolution to maintain the momentum critical to operational success. These engagements reveal the complexity of ending a war that was over in principle, but not yet resolved on the ground. The refusal of surrender was more than obstinacy. It was a manifestation of the fog of war, fear, and misperception, all intersecting under extreme pressure. U.S. forces had to navigate these uncertainties, applying doctrine, judgment, and firepower to transform potential chaos into managed outcomes. In doing so, they reinforced the principle that the costs of hesitation, miscommunication, or tolerance of defiance could be immediate, profound, and irreversible, leaving the story of these final confrontations open for further exploration of how individual choices and small-scale decisions shaped the course of World War II's closing months. As U.S. forces pressed toward the heart of Germany, the geographic and social landscape compounded the challenges of these engagements. Urban areas presented labyrinthine streets, dense building clusters, and fortified structures that magnified the dangers posed by a single German officer refusing surrender. Each building could conceal machine guns, snipers, or small explosive devices. Forested areas and industrial complexes created choke points where a few determined defenders could slow an entire advance. In this environment, the decisions of one officer reverberated far beyond his immediate command, forcing American leaders to weigh tactical, operational, and humanitarian considerations simultaneously. The American response relied on coordinated combined arms tactics honed over years of combat. Infantry units, often acting in concert with armored elements, sought to encircle resisting positions and cut off escape or reinforcement routes. Artillery and mortar fire was used selectively to suppress or neutralize threats without causing unnecessary destruction to nearby civilian structures when possible. Communication between units became essential. Forward observers and radio links ensured that supporting fire was accurate and timely. Every maneuver reflected the dual imperatives of enforcing compliance and preserving the momentum of the advance. Psychological pressure played a critical role alongside physical force. Soldiers frequently used loudspeakers or shouted warnings, making it clear that surrender remained an option, but emphasizing that continued resistance would be met with overwhelming force. This approach leveraged human psychology to achieve compliance while minimizing unnecessary combat. The interplay between threat and opportunity illustrates the central tension of such engagements. The enemy's defiance created urgency, but the structured application of doctrine allowed U.S. forces to manage risk. The German officers' mindset was shaped by a combination of ideology, duty, and fear. Many refused to surrender because of ingrained military culture, fearing retribution from superiors or viewing capitulation as dishonorable. Others acted out of concern for civilians or subordinates, calculating that holding their ground might delay the enemy and protect those in their charge. Some were simply uncertain of the war's progress or misinformed about surrounding events. American forces had to anticipate these motivations, while responding decisively to maintain the initiative. Training and doctrine proved crucial in these encounters. American soldiers were educated to recognize surrender gestures and to enforce compliance, but also to react immediately when such gestures were absent or clearly rejected. This emphasis on rapid assessment and action minimized hesitation in the field and reduced the likelihood of casualties. Units became adept at reading subtle signs of intent, quickly distinguishing between indecision, deception, and deliberate refusal. Civilians remained a persistent factor. Encounters in towns and villages required U.S. forces to navigate streets filled with noncombatants, often under fire. The presence of civilians complicated targeting, evacuation, and maneuvering, forcing soldiers to maintain discipline while applying force precisely. The tactical challenge was therefore inseparable from moral and legal responsibility, a balance that reinforced the complexity of battlefield decision-making. The strategic implications of individual refusals were also significant. Even isolated pockets of resistance could delay broader operational timelines, tie down resources, and create gaps in coordinated advances. Each German officer's decision to hold or surrender influenced logistics, reinforcement schedules, and the sequencing of objectives. High Command monitored these localized events closely, understanding that small-scale resistance could ripple outward to affect theater-wide operations. Patterns emerging from these engagements revealed a structured approach. U.S. forces typically attempted verbal negotiation first, clarifying that surrender would be accepted immediately. When refusal persisted, they applied measured yet decisive force, escalating as required. The aim was to neutralize the threat swiftly while protecting the larger operational objective. Doctrine, training, and experience converged to transform potentially chaotic standoffs into predictable, controlled outcomes. Veterans later reflected on the intensity of these moments. The psychological strain, the rapid decision-making, and the ethical calculations left lasting impressions. Soldiers spoke of the split-second judgment calls required when a surrender was denied, and the simultaneous relief and gravity that accompanied the conclusion of each encounter. These personal experiences underscore the human dimension of what might otherwise be understood as purely tactical events. By late April and May of 1945, as the German army disintegrated, such standoffs became more frequent but increasingly isolated in scale. The broader collapse of German command and communication meant that resistance often lacked coordination or purpose beyond the immediate position. Yet even in these fragmented engagements, the stakes remained real. A single officer's refusal could still endanger lives, delay operations, or alter the pace of advance. The consistency of U.S. responses, rapid assessment, application of force, and acceptance of surrender demonstrates a disciplined adaptation to uncertainty under extreme pressure. These encounters illustrate that the closing months of World War II were not uniformly orderly. Victory at the strategic level did not automatically translate into unchallenged local control. Each refusal to surrender was a microcosm of the larger war, a moment where human decision, doctrine, and circumstance collided. They highlight how pressure, uncertainty, and consequence shape behavior on both sides, and how individual acts of defiance could reverberate far beyond their immediate context, leaving the narrative of the war open for continued exploration of command, judgment, and survival under fire.